On my birthday, my own mother showed up uninvited. She didn't bring love, just cold words. You'll never be enough. Then she slipped cash to my neighbor, as if I couldn't survive on my own. I stayed silent, calm. But weeks later, when her house went up for sale, guess who bought it? I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you are watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. The sterile scent of disinfectant clung to the air as Evelyn Carter sat stiffly in the chair across from Dr. Martinez. Her hands, curled slightly at the knuckles, pulsed with an ache that felt older than her years, as though her very bones had been keeping secrets they could no longer contain. She watched the doctor's lips move, the words spilling out with professional calmness, but they seemed to ricochet off her ears like stones skipping across water. Rheumatoid arthritis, advanced stage, progressive joint damage. Each term landed with a heaviness she felt not only in her joints but in her chest. Evelyn's fingers trembled in her lap, not from nerves alone, but from the betrayal of her own body. Her knuckles were swollen, her wrists stiff, her knees reluctant to bend when she shifted in her seat. It was as if her body had been waiting for permission to hurt, and now it had been granted in the most clinical way possible. She swallowed hard, her throat dry, her heart beating against her ribs with an anxious rhythm. "Mrs. Carter," Dr. Martinez said gently, her warm brown eyes radiating practiced compassion, the kind that comes from delivering bad news daily. "Do you have family support at home?" "Yes," Evelyn managed to whisper, though her voice was thin, barely carried across the room. "I live with my son and his wife." She left it at that. And she didn't say how long she had been under their roof. She didn't explain that it had been 3 long years since Harold's passing, 3 years of adjusting to a house that wasn't hers, to a smile from Meadow that thinned with every month, to a son whose eyes avoided hers when conflict stirred. Her mind, unbidden, slipped back to Harold. She remembered his hand, large and warm, enveloping hers during sleepless nights, remembered the steady way he always said, "We'll get through this, Evie." The memory pierced her like a blade, reminding her that he wasn't here to get her through anything anymore. She was alone, even when she technically wasn't. Dr. Martinez handed her a pamphlet filled with diagrams of joints and treatment plans. Evelyn stared at it without seeing. What good were sterile drawings when her reality was the raw, grinding ache of every movement? She tucked it into her purse anyway, because she was polite, because she had always been the kind of woman who nodded, who endured, who held her silence even when her heart screamed. The drive home blurred past in muted colors. The city was alive with traffic, but Evelyn saw little of it. Her thoughts pressed heavily against her chest. Would Meadow resent her more, now that she couldn't even hide the stiffness, the pain, the way her body moved slower each day? Would Blaine continue to avoid confrontation, as he always did, leaving her to absorb the sharp edges of Meadow's words alone? She feared she already knew the answers. When the house came into view, Evelyn felt that familiar tightening in her stomach. It wasn't a home. It was a place she occupied, a roof she was allowed beneath because of obligation, not love. Meadow's car was already parked outside, sleek and polished, a reflection of the pride she carried in appearances. Evelyn stepped inside quietly, her cane clicking against the floorboards like an unwanted announcement. Meadow's voice carried from the kitchen. "You're late." No greeting, no warmth, just a flat observation sharpened by irritation. Blaine sat at the table, hunched over his phone, not looking up. Evelyn forced a smile that never touched her eyes. "Doctor's appointment ran long," she said softly, as if apologizing for the very act of existing. Her daughter-in-law turned, her perfectly arched brows pulling together. "Doctor's appointment? Again?" The unspoken words hung in the air. More problems, more burden. Evelyn nodded, swallowing down her pride, her explanations, her sorrow. There was no room for weakness here. Not in a household where every sigh was judged, every ache interpreted as inconvenience. Later that night, Evelyn sat on the edge of her bed, the ache in her joints radiating through her body. But worse than that was the ache in her heart. She pressed her hand against the old photograph of Harold that she kept on her nightstand. His smile, frozen in time, seemed to tell her to hold on. But to what? To a son who couldn't defend her? To a daughter-in-law who saw her as nothing more than a weight? She closed her eyes, and for a moment she let the tears slip down her cheeks. But she wiped them quickly, almost angrily. She had lived through too much, carried too much to allow herself the luxury of falling apart now. Somewhere deep inside her, beneath the weariness, beneath the pain, there was a quiet ember of defiance. They didn't know everything about her. They thought they had the power to push her out, to diminish her. They didn't know what she held close, locked away, waiting, not yet. For now, she would endure. For now, she would let them underestimate her. Because one truth Evelyn Carter had learned through years of hardship was this: sometimes survival was not about showing strength openly, but about keeping it tucked away until the moment it was needed most. And that moment, she sensed, was drawing near. The tension had been building for months, as steady and inevitable as water wearing down stone. Evelyn Carter felt it in every clipped word, in the way Meadows' lips tightened whenever she entered a room, in the silence that followed her footsteps down the hallway. Living under their roof was never meant to be permanent, but Harold's death had left her hollow, and Blaine's promise to take her in had seemed like salvation at the time. Now it felt like a slow exile within her own family. That evening, the air was heavy with the scent of garlic and frying oil. Meadows stood in the kitchen, her sleeves rolled up, chopping with sharp, efficient strokes. The clatter of the knife against the cutting board seemed louder than it should have been. Evelyn hovered near the counter, wanting to offer help, but her hands throbbed with stiffness, and she knew her presence was not welcome. Blaine sat at the table, hunched forward, pretending to scroll through his phone as if it could shield him from the storm brewing in his own house. "Dinner will be late," Meadow announced flatly, her back still turned. Evelyn murmured something about not being hungry, but it was too soft to be heard. Or perhaps Meadow chose not to hear it. Later, when the plates were finally set in the food portion with mechanical precision, Evelyn picked at the meal quietly. Her fork clinked against the ceramic, every sound magnified in the tense silence. She was painfully aware of Meadows' gaze flicking toward her swollen fingers as if the sight alone was an irritation. Blaine kept his head down, eating quickly, as though finishing sooner meant escaping sooner. It happened suddenly, like a spark catching flame. Meadows slammed her fork down, the sound sharp enough to make Evelyn flinch. "I can't do this anymore," she snapped, her voice sharp and rising. "I'm not going to spend the rest of my life taking care of a sick old woman." The words hung in the air, heavy and cruel. Evelyn's chest constricted, her breath catching. Blaine looked up, startled, his eyes darting between his wife and his mother. His lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Meadow pushed her chair back, her face flushed with anger. "You think this is fair? You think I signed up for this? I married you, Blaine, not your mother. And yet here she is, day after day, dragging this house down with her complaints, her doctor's appointments, her endless needs. I'm done." Evelyn felt heat rush to her face, a mixture of shame and heartbreak. She tried to steady her voice, though it quivered. "I never wanted to be a burden," she whispered. "I can manage." "Manage?" Meadow let out a sharp laugh, bitter and cutting. "You can barely get out of bed some days. You're not managing, Evelyn. You're surviving off us. And I refuse to live like this." Blaine finally spoke, his voice low, almost pleading. "Meadow, please." But she cut him off with a glare. "No, don't you dare defend this. We're not her caretakers. We're supposed to be building our own life, and she's in the middle of it, taking up space, taking up money, taking up everything." Evelyn's fork slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the plate. The sound was small, but it felt like an explosion in the silence that followed. Blaine's mouth opened and closed, his indecision painted across his face. He was a man divided, torn between loyalty to his wife and duty to his mother, and in the end, he did nothing. His silence was louder than Meadows' shouting. "I'll go," Evelyn said softly, though her voice broke around the words. She stood, her chair scraping the floor, her knees trembling beneath her. "If I'm unwanted here, I'll go." Meadow crossed her arms, her expression unyielding. "That's best for everyone." Blaine looked down, his eyes fixed on the table. He didn't meet his mother's gaze. Not once. Evelyn retreated to her small room, her body shaking with every step. She shut the door behind her and pressed her back against it, the weight of Meadows' words sinking deep into her bones. She had always feared being a burden, but hearing it spoken aloud spat at her with such venom cut deeper than any physical pain. Her hands trembled as she gathered her few belongings, a worn sweater, a stack of old letters, Harold's photograph. She moved slowly, her joints aching, but her heart aching more. When she stepped outside later that night, the air was cool and still. The stars blinked faintly above, indifferent to her sorrow. She carried a small suitcase, her cane clicking against the pavement. No one followed her out, no one stopped her. Blaine didn't call after her, didn't fight for her. The door closed softly behind her, sealing the betrayal and finality. Evelyn walked away from the house that had never been a home, her steps unsteady but determined. Every movement hurt, but she pressed forward, her chest tight, her eyes burning. The silence of the night wrapped around her, and for the first time in years she was truly alone. The pain was sharp, but beneath it, a thought flickered quietly in the corners of her mind. They had no idea what she carried within her, what she still had left to reveal. And that secret, untouched and unspoken, would be her strength. The night after Evelyn Carter was cast out burned itself into her memory, not with the heat of anger, but with the cold sting of abandonment. Her suitcase sat at her side in the dimly lit motel room she'd managed to find, the hum of the old air conditioner filling the silence. She sat at the edge of the bed, her cane resting against the wall, her hands stiff and aching from the walk. Betrayal weighed heavy on her chest, but beneath the sorrow, something else stirred. A quiet fire she had carried for years, a fire no one knew about. She leaned forward, reaching for the small velvet pouch she had hidden deep in her luggage. Her fingers brushed against it, the fabric soft yet solid with the weight inside. With trembling hands, she pulled it out and placed it on the bed before her. Slowly, deliberately, Evelyn opened the pouch, and from it came a glint of metal. Keys. Not just any keys, the keys to her safety deposit box, the one she had kept secret since Harold's passing. Her heart quickened, not with fear, but with anticipation. For so long, she had lived as if she were fragile, as if she had nothing. Meadow had looked at her like dead weight. Blaine had treated her like glass that might shatter at any moment. They had no idea that Evelyn was not empty-handed, not powerless, not dependent. They had no idea she held the fortune Harold had entrusted to her, hidden carefully away, $28 million untouched, waiting. She remembered the day Harold had told her. He had sat her down at the oak dining table in their old home, his hand steady as he slid a folder across the wood. "For the future, Evie," he'd said, his voice calm but firm. "Don't spend it unless you needed it, and don't tell anyone, not Blaine, not Meadow, not anyone, to him. You'll know when the time is right." She had thought the moment might never come. But tonight, alone, bruised by betrayal, Evelyn knew the time had arrived. Her eyes burned as she whispered to the empty room, "You thought I was weak, Meadow. You thought I was nothing." The bitterness in her voice surprised even herself. "But you have no idea who you just threw away." She rose from the bed, her body stiff but fueled now by a force greater than pain. She gripped the keys tightly, her knuckles pale. Tomorrow she would go to the bank. Tomorrow she would walk into the vault that had been hers for years, untouched by anyone's greed, but safeguarded for this very moment. Tomorrow, Evelyn Carter would remind herself that she was not a beggar at her daughter-in-law's mercy. She was a woman with power, with choice, with means. She lowered herself back down on the mattress, exhaustion flooding through her joints. Still, her heart thudded with the rhythm of new resolve. For years she had been quiet, enduring slights, enduring silence, enduring the slow erasure of her place in her son's home. But now she saw it clearly. She had been waiting. She had been patient. And patience, when paired with power, was a weapon stronger than any cruelty Meadow could wield. As sleep began to pull at her heavy eyelids, Evelyn allowed herself the smallest of smiles. They thought they had seen the last of her. They thought her story ended at the doorstep they pushed her through. But her story was just beginning. And when the truth revealed itself, when the fortune came into light, it would be Meadow who trembled, Meadow who begged, Meadow who would learn what it meant to underestimate the wrong woman. So she would endure tonight's loneliness. She would carry tomorrow's ache. Because behind her gentle silence lived a storm. And soon that storm would break over those who thought they had discarded her. If you're listening now, lean in close. This is where everything changes. This is where betrayal begins to turn into justice. Follow the rest of Evelyn's journey and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because you will not want to miss the moment when the truth crashes down. The following morning, Evelyn Carter stood before the towering facade of the bank, her cane planted firmly on the sidewalk, her heart beating with a rhythm that seemed to echo through her entire body. The glass doors shimmered in the sun, pristine and intimidating, but she walked toward them with steady resolve. Each step was painful, her joints protesting with sharp reminders, yet there was a force inside her greater than the ache. She had been dismissed, humiliated, cast out like she was nothing. Today she would remind herself, and soon enough others, that she was far from nothing. Inside, the marble floors gleamed beneath the harsh lighting. People in tailored suits moved briskly, their conversations hushed and clipped. Evelyn approached the counter, her voice calm but firm, as she gave her name and requested access to her safety deposit box. The clerk, polite but detached, glanced at her identification and nodded, guiding her toward the vault. The chill of the underground corridor seeped into her skin, but she held her head high, her fingers gripping the cane like it was an extension of her will. The vault door groaned open, revealing rows upon rows of locked boxes. Evelyn's key slid in with ease, a sound she had not heard in years. When the box was pulled free and set before her, she paused for a moment, her hand hovering above it, her breath caught in her throat. Then with deliberate care she opened it. Inside lay the documents, the certificates, the proof of everything Harold had left behind. Bank statements, investment portfolios, property deeds, all meticulously organized, all untouched since the day she had sealed them away. Her hands trembled as she sifted through the papers. Not from weakness alone, but from the enormity of it. This was not merely money. It was Harold's foresight. It was his protection. It was their lifetime of sacrifice, preserved for a moment like this. $28 million, a fortune that could build or destroy, depending on who held it. And now it was hers to wield, not as a shield, but as a sword. Evelyn's lips curved into a small, resolute smile. Meadow had thought she was powerless. Blaine had chosen silence over loyalty. They had both believed she was a dependent woman, clinging to scraps of their pity. But she was no one's burden. She was a force waiting to be recognized. And now she knew what she had to do. The following week was a blur of meetings, contracts, and signatures. Evelyn, though weary from the demands, carried herself with quiet authority. She sat across from lawyers in polished offices, her voice steady as she explained her intentions. She spoke with real estate agents who initially underestimated her, only to be silenced by the weight of her bank statements. Piece by piece, the plan unfolded, and Evelyn's new reality began to take shape. One afternoon, she stood in front of a different building, the condo complex where Blaine and Meadow lived. Its brick exterior loomed high, a place she had walked into countless times before with a heavy heart, carrying groceries or trying to remain unnoticed. Now she gazed at it with new eyes, not as a resident or a guest, but as its future owner. Her lawyer walked beside her, flipping through papers, explaining terms, but she hardly needed the details. The decision had already been made. She signed the documents with a flourish, the pen steady in her hand despite the stiffness of her fingers. With every stroke of ink, the balance of power shifted. By the time the sun dipped low, Evelyn Carter owned the entire building. The irony was sharp, almost cruel in its elegance. Meadow had thrown her out, sneered at her as if she were disposable. Yet Evelyn now controlled the very roof over Meadow's head. The satisfaction was undeniable, though Evelyn's heart was not entirely at peace. This was not born of malice alone. It was justice, perhaps even a lesson, though whether it would be learned remained to be seen. That night, Evelyn returned to her modest motel room, her body aching from the day's exertion, but her spirit lifted by the knowledge of what she had accomplished. She sat on the edge of the bed, Harold's photograph beside her, and whispered softly, "You'd be proud of me, Harold. I didn't let them break me." The tears that welled in her eyes were not of weakness, but of release, a testament to the strength she had carried in silence for so long. Across town, Meadow laughed over a glass of wine, oblivious to the storm gathering just beyond her door. Blaine sat beside her, his expression tired, his silence as heavy as ever. They had no idea that the ground beneath them had shifted, that their lives were about to be rewritten by the very woman they had dismissed. And Evelyn, in the quiet of her room, waited. She had taken the boldest step of her life. Now all that remained was to watch the truth unfold. The letter slid through the slot in Meadow Carter's door on a crisp morning, its edges sharp and official, its weight far heavier than the paper it carried. She found it as she stepped into the hallway, coffee mug in hand, her robe pulled tight around her waist. With a careless flick, she tore it open, expecting another bill or mundane notice. But as her eyes moved across the page, the color drained from her face. Rent increase, effective immediately. Tripled. The mug slipped from her grasp and shattered against the hardwood, coffee bleeding out in dark streams across the floor. Meadow's hands shook, clutching the paper so tightly it crumpled under her fingers. "No," she whispered, as if denial alone could erase the words. This has to be a mistake." Blaine appeared from the bedroom, rubbing sleep from his eyes, his tie hanging loose around his neck. "What happened?" His gaze dropped to the shards of porcelain at her feet, then to the paper clutched in her hand. Meadow thrust it at him, her voice rising into panic. "Read it. They can't do this. They can't just... This has to be illegal." Blaine scanned the letter, his brow furrowing deeper with every line. He read it again, as if the words might change, but they remained mercilessly clear. "It says here the new owner of the building approved it," he said slowly, almost disbelieving. The landlord changed. Meadow's face twisted with outrage. "New owner? Who? Who would be so cruel, so greedy? To raise rent like this? Triple? That's..." She broke off, pacing the length of the living room like a caged animal. Her robe dragged across the spilled coffee, but she didn't notice. Her mind was too consumed by the sudden shadow looming over their lives. Evelyn Carter, watching from a distance in her car parked across the street, allowed herself a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. From behind the tinted glass, she saw Meadow's frantic gestures, the way Blaine tried to calm her but failed, the chaos unfolding within walls Evelyn now owned. Her chest tightened with conflicting emotions. Satisfaction swelled inside her, sharp and undeniable, but it was accompanied by a pang of sorrow. This wasn't joy, this was justice, rough and unpolished, born from a wound still raw. She remembered Meadow's words echoing in her ears. "I won't take care of a sick, old woman." The sting of that rejection had nearly broken her. But now Evelyn held the power. And with that power came a strange, bittersweet taste. She hadn't chosen this path out of malice. She had chosen it because she had been left no other choice. Inside the apartment, Meadow's panic escalated. "We can't afford this, Blaine. We can barely keep up with what we're paying now. Triple? They're trying to drive us out. This is targeted. I know it is." Her voice cracked, shrill with desperation. She slammed the letter down on the table, her eyes wild. "Find out who it is. Find out who bought this place. I want to know who thinks they can destroy us." Blaine ran a hand through his hair, his face weary. He didn't answer right away. He knew Meadow's anger, knew it well, and knew better than to fan its flames. But inside, something stirred, an unease he couldn't name. Whoever had purchased the building held their fate in their hands, and the faceless cruelty of the rent hike gnawed at him. He looked at his wife's flushed face, at the shards of her broken mug, and he felt the weight of helplessness settle in his chest. Back in her car, Evelyn's eyes glistened. She whispered to herself, her voice trembling, "This is what it takes." Her fingers tightened around the steering wheel. This is what it takes for them to see. The following days brought no relief for Meadow. Each hour she circled the same questions, pacing through the apartment like a storm contained in four walls. She called the property manager, only to be met with polite indifference. She demanded answers, but none came. Every response was the same. The new owner set the terms. If you cannot comply, you are free to vacate. Blaine tried to soothe her, suggesting they explore options, maybe even look for a smaller place. But Meadow refused. Pride burned too hot within her. "I will not be forced out," she spat, slamming her fist against the counter. "This is my home, and no faceless landlord will take it from me." Evelyn, meanwhile, moved with quiet deliberation. She attended meetings, signed additional documents, reinforced her ownership with precision Harold himself would have admired. Yet in the stillness of her nights, she sat alone in the modest motel room, clutching the photo of her late husband. You told me I'd know when the time was right, she whispered to his image. I think, I think this is it. But why does it hurt so much? Her tears blurred the glass and she wiped them away, forcing herself to be strong. She could not falter now, not when she had come this far. As Meadows' rage festered, Evelyn's resolve hardened. She wasn't simply punishing them, she was teaching them, though she doubted Meadow would ever see it that way. Still, Evelyn believed Blaine might. She held onto that fragile hope, tucked it close to her chest like a fragile flame in the wind. And as the days turned into weeks, Meadows' fury only deepened. Each rent notice was another strike against her pride, each unanswered question another spark of rage. She could not yet see the face behind the cruelty. She could not imagine that the woman she had cast out into the night now held the keys to her suffering. But that moment was coming. Evelyn knew it. She could feel it in her bones, in the very joints that ached with every step. The truth would come, and when it did, Meadow would finally learn what it meant to underestimate the wrong woman. So keep listening closely. This is only the beginning of Evelyn Carter's reckoning. If her secret stunned you, just wait until you hear what happens when the masks fall away. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because the moment of truth is closer than you think. Meadow Carter had never felt walls closing in on her quite like this. Each morning, the rent notice seemed to glare from the refrigerator door, a cruel reminder of a battle she hadn't chosen but now had no way to escape. The numbers stared back at her, unreasonable, merciless, suffocating. Her hands shook each time she touched the paper, as if it burned her fingertips. The apartment, once her sanctuary, had grown tense and airless. She moved from room to room with restless energy, slamming drawers, snapping at small inconveniences, unable to silence the thoughts pounding in her head. She cursed the new landlord daily, inventing faces for the unseen enemy who had set her life ablaze with the stroke of a pen. Blaine tried to steady her storm. "We'll find a way," he murmured one night, reaching for her hand as they sat in the dim light of the living room. But Meadow jerked away, her voice sharp with frustration. "You don't get it. This isn't just about money. This is about respect. Someone thinks they can humiliate me, chase me out like I'm nothing. I won't let them win." Her eyes glistened with fury, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. She didn't sleep much anymore. She'd lie awake long after Blaine drifted off, staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying every unanswered question. Who owned the building now? Who had the audacity to push her family against a wall? She imagined a greedy investor, a nameless tycoon, some faceless vulture circling above. The thought made her sick, but it also fueled her defiance. Across town, Evelyn Carter sat alone in her motel room, her body weary but her spirit unyielding. Papers lay scattered across the small table, documents signed with her trembling hand, each one sealing her authority. She had never envisioned herself wielding such power, but here she was, the architect of Meadows' downfall. Yet the victory tasted strange. Each time she saw Meadows' silhouette pacing inside the apartment through the lens of memory, she felt her chest tighten. Evelyn wasn't blind to the pain she caused, nor deaf to the cries that echoed in her imagination. Still, she reminded herself of that night, the slammed door, the cruel words, the abandonment. "She left me no choice," Evelyn whispered, clutching Harold's photograph. "This isn't revenge. This is survival. This is the only way she'll ever understand." The days slipped by with a rhythm that felt like slow torment. Meadows' phone calls to the management office yielded nothing but cold reassurances. The terms are final, payment required by the first of the month. No explanations, no sympathy, no loopholes. Each interaction chipped away at her patience until all that remained was raw fury. Her neighbors began to notice the change. Meadow, once brisk and polite in passing, now snapped at casual greetings or ignored them altogether. She avoided eye contact, her shoulders tight, her jaw clenched. The weight of impending eviction hung over her, and she wore it like armor. Blaine, quieter than usual, seemed to shrink under the tension, retreating into silence rather than fueling her fire. One evening, Meadow stood by the window, staring out at the darkened street. "They're trying to break me," she muttered, almost to herself, "but I won't let them." Her reflection in the glass looked unfamiliar. Eyes rimmed with exhaustion, mouth hardened into a line that rarely softened anymore. Blaine approached cautiously, placing a hand on her shoulder. She flinched but didn't move away. He whispered, "Maybe we should just go. Start over somewhere else." Her head snapped toward him, eyes blazing. "And let them win? Let them push us out like trash? Never." Her voice cracked on the last word, but her resolve didn't falter. To leave would mean surrender, and Meadow Carter had never surrendered to anyone. Meanwhile, Evelyn's nights were equally restless. Though her body demanded rest, her mind replayed every detail of her choices. She imagined Meadow's rage, Blaine's quiet sorrow, the tension rippling through their lives like aftershocks. Sometimes she questioned herself, wondered if Harold would approve. Other times she felt certain she was honoring him, teaching their daughter the lesson of compassion through the harshest mirror imaginable. She often drove past the building in silence, watching from the safety of her car. Meadow's curtains were always drawn, but Evelyn could sense the turmoil inside. It pained her, yet it also steeled her. She whispered to the steering wheel, to the empty seat beside her, "You have to understand, Harold. She needs to feel this. Otherwise, she'll never learn." The city moved around them. Neighbors went to work. Children played in the streets. Laughter and arguments carried through thin walls. But within Meadow's apartment, the atmosphere grew heavier by the day. It wasn't just a home anymore. It was a battleground. Each bill, each deadline, each reminder from management felt like another blow in a fight she refused to lose. As the first of the month drew nearer, the pressure became unbearable. Meadow's pride refused to bend, yet the reality of their finances loomed like a dark cloud. Blaine avoided bringing it up, afraid of sparking another explosion, but the numbers didn't lie. Sooner or later, something would break, and Evelyn knew it. She waited quietly, holding her breath. Her heart braced for the inevitable moment when the storm inside her daughter's home would collide with the truth she had orchestrated. That collision was coming. The silence in Meadow Carter's apartment had become unbearable. It wasn't the kind of silence that brought peace. It was the suffocating quiet of dread, heavy and oppressive, wrapping itself around every corner of the small space. The rent deadline was days away, and each passing hour throbbed like a countdown inside her chest. Her hands trembled as she clutched the latest notice, the bold red letters slicing into her like a knife. Final warning, the words blurred through her tears, but their meaning was unmistakable. She slammed the paper onto the table, her voice hoarse with rage. "They want to destroy me. They want me crawling." Blaine stood in the doorway, his face pale, his eyes shadowed with fatigue. "Meadow," he said softly, almost pleading, "we can't keep doing this. We don't have the money. We can't fight numbers with anger." She spun towards him, her face flushed, eyes burning with defiance. "Don't you dare tell me to give up. That's what they want, to watch me break, to see me pack up and leave like a coward. No, I'll die before I let that happen." Her voice cracked, and in that crack, Blaine heard the echo of her desperation. He wanted to hold her, to quiet the storm raging inside her, but every time he tried, her pride pushed him away. So he stood frozen, helpless, as the woman he loved unraveled piece by piece. Across the city, Evelyn Carter sat in her car, parked on a quiet street, staring at the apartment building she once called home. She hadn't dared approach the door, hadn't risked facing Meadow's eyes. Not yet. But she came here almost every night, parked beneath the street lamp, watching the dim glow in her daughter's window. Her fingers tightened around the steering wheel. She whispered into the emptiness, "This is the only way, Meadow. You'll hate me, but someday you'll understand." The lie rolled off her tongue with practiced ease, but deep inside, she wasn't sure she believed it. Each night she went back to her lonely motel room, her chest aching with the weight of what she'd done. Inside the apartment, the air grew heavier by the day. Meadow no longer cooked meals, no longer laughed at Blaine's attempts to lighten the mood. She barely ate, barely slept, pacing the living room like a caged animal. Her once vibrant spirit had sharpened into something cold and brittle. On the night before the deadline, Blaine tried one last time. He took her hand, his voice trembling. "Please, Meadow, let's leave. We'll find another place. We'll start fresh. I'd rather live in a shack with you than watch you destroy yourself here." She yanked her hand free, her voice rising to a scream. "No, this is my home. This is my life. If I walk away, I'm nothing. Do you hear me? Nothing. The room shook with her words, and for the first time, Blaine saw not just anger in her eyes, but fear, raw, desperate fear of losing everything she believed made her strong. He wanted to argue, but his throat tightened. He couldn't fight her pride. That night, Meadow sat by the window, her face lit by the faint glow of the streetlights outside. Her reflection stared back at her, hollow eyes, clenched jaw, a woman on the edge of breaking. She pressed her forehead against the glasses, whispering into the darkness, "Whoever you are, you'll regret the day you tried to destroy me." What she didn't know was that Evelyn, her own mother, sat just across the street, hidden in the shadows of her car, hearing nothing but feeling everything. The deadline was here, and with it, the moment that would shatter both their worlds. The storm wasn't coming. It had already arrived. Morning arrived heavy with dread. The thin walls of Meadow's apartment seemed to close in, carrying the stale air of sleepless nights and unspoken fears. She sat hunched at the kitchen table, an untouched cup of coffee cooling beside her. Outside, the world carried on. Cars hummed along the street. Neighbors exchanged greetings. But inside, time had stopped, thick with the weight of what was coming. Blaine moved quietly around the apartment, gathering papers, folding clothes, anything to keep himself occupied. His chest ached with helplessness. He had begged her, pleaded with her, yet Meadow's eyes had remained fixed on the invisible line she refused to cross. To him, it wasn't about walls or rent notices, it was about her. But to Meadow, surrender meant erasing herself entirely. She held the eviction letter in her hands again, tracing the edges until her fingers grew raw. The words stared back at her with cruel finality. Every fiber of her being screamed to fight, to resist. But beneath that fire lingered exhaustion so deep it hollowed her bones. Across the street, Evelyn watched from behind the wheel of her car. She hadn't left since the night before. Her face was pale in the morning light, her lips pressed into a trembling line. She whispered to herself, "Just a little longer, I can't let her fall." Yet she knew she already had let her fall, and the guilt pressed into her chest like a stone. The motel mirror had shown her a stranger each night, a woman aged not by years but by choices. She had justified everything, told herself she was protecting her daughter, forcing her to stand on her own. But as she watched Meadow's shadow move through the thin curtains of the apartment, the truth gnawed at her. She had stripped her own child of safety, all while pretending it was love. Inside, Meadow's voice cracked the silence. "They think they've won. They think I'll crawl, but I won't." She clutched the letter until her knuckles whitened, her breath sharp and uneven. Blaine stepped toward her, his hands trembling as he reached for hers. "You don't have to carry this alone," he whispered. "You still have me." Her eyes flicked to his, glossy with unshed tears, but her pride sealed her lips. She couldn't bear to admit how badly she needed someone to hold her together. The silence between them spoke louder than words ever could. The day dragged on, each hour pulling her closer to the inevitable. By afternoon, the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside made Meadow's chest tighten. Every knock on a neighbor's door jolted her like a gunshot. She hovered near the window, peeking through the blinds, waiting for the moment the storm would crash through her own door. Evelyn remained in her car, her nails digging crescents into the steering wheel. She rehearsed confessions she couldn't speak. "I did this to you, Meadow. I thought I was saving you, but I was only saving myself." The words stuck in her throat, unspoken, swallowed by fear. She told herself she'd reveal the truth one day, when her daughter was stronger, when the wounds had healed. But in her heart, she knew there might never be a day like that. As the sun dipped low, casting orange light across the street, Meadow sank to the floor, her back against the wall. The weight of defiance pressed on her chest, heavier than the walls themselves. Blaine sat beside her in silence, his shoulder brushing hers. For the first time in days, she leaned into him, just enough to feel he was real, just enough to keep from falling apart. No words passed between them, but Blaine understood. Pride was her armor, her prison, her curse. And though it shielded her, it was slowly destroying her. Outside, Evelyn finally started the car. Her hands shook as she turned the key, her eyes lingering on the faint silhouette of her daughter framed in the window. She whispered a promise into the night. "One day, Meadow, one day you'll know why." The engine rumbled, and she drove off into the fading light, leaving behind the daughter who unknowingly carried the weight of her mother's secret betrayal. The night was suffocatingly still. The walls of Meadows' apartment hummed with silence, broken only by the faint ticking of the old clock on the kitchen counter. Midnight had passed, but sleep refused to come. She sat curled on the couch, knees drawn to her chest, staring at the eviction letter on the coffee table. The paper was crumpled now, edges frayed from her restless hands. It looked like her, worn, torn, yet stubbornly intact. Blaine had fallen asleep in the chair beside her, his head tilted at an awkward angle, his body twisted from the weight of loyalty he didn't know how to put down. Even in his dreams, his brow furrowed, as if his soul was still fighting for her. Meadows' chest rose and fell with uneven breaths. She had always believed her defiance could keep her standing, but tonight it felt more like a chain around her neck. Pride had carried her this far, yet now it left her stranded, suspended between fight and surrender. She wanted to believe she was unbreakable, but inside she was unraveling. Across the dark street, Evelyn's car sat hidden in shadow. She hadn't left. Her fingers clutched the rosary dangling from her rearview mirror, though she hadn't prayed in years. Her lips moved soundlessly, pleading not to God, but to the daughter she could not face. "Hold on, Meadow. Please hold on." The truth pressed against her ribcage like broken glass. She had orchestrated every twist of this storm. Each choice she made had been disguised as love, as guidance, but stripped bare. It was control, her desperate attempt to shape her daughter's path, no matter the cost. She had thought herself strong, but now she saw herself for what she was, a coward who had hidden in motels and car seats while her daughter bled silently behind thin apartment walls. Meadow stood pacing, her bare feet cold against the floor. She whispered to herself as if saying the words aloud might keep her sane. "They won't see me crawl. They won't. I'm not nothing." Her voice cracked at the last word, betraying the fragility behind her armor. Blaine stirred, opening his eyes. He watched her from the chair, his voice rough with sleep. "You don't have to keep proving yourself. Not to them. Not to anyone." She turned sharply, eyes glistening in the dim light. "If I stop fighting, I disappear. Don't you get it? The moment I let go, I become exactly what they want me to be." He rose and stepped closer, his presence steady, his hands trembling as he reached for her shoulders. "You're already more than they'll ever see. You don't need their approval to exist, Meadow. You just need to breathe." But she shook her head, pulling away, pressing her palms against the wall, as if the plaster itself held her up. Breathing isn't enough. Living isn't enough if it means living on their terms. Blaine's heart ached at her words, but he didn't argue. He only stood near, close enough to catch her if she fell. The first light of dawn crept in, thin and gray, brushing against her face. She looked toward the window, eyes heavy with exhaustion, but her posture unyielding. Outside, the world stirred awake. Inside, Meadow remained trapped in the storm she refused to surrender. In her car, Evelyn finally broke. Tears spilled down her face, blurring the glass as the morning light touched her trembling hands. She wanted to run to the door, to hold her daughter, to confess everything. But the weight of her own choices pinned her down. Fear whispered cruelly, "If she knows the truth, she'll never forgive you. You'll lose her forever." So she stayed hidden, watching, waiting, as Meadow's silhouette stood tall against the window, fragile yet unbroken. For one suspended moment, mother and daughter faced the same dawn, separated by walls, silence, and secrets neither could destroy. The world moved forward. The clock ticked, and Meadow, standing in defiance of everything closing in, whispered to herself words Evelyn would never hear. "I will not vanish."